Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 123. I'm delighted today to be joined by Clive Brewer, performance specialist, currently based over in the US. So, Clive, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Ben. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks for giving up your time, mate. I really appreciate it. I think we've got some really exciting topics to delve into as well. Now, I'm sure plenty of the listeners have seen your career and seen where you've been so far and seen what you've been up to. But do you want to just take us through your background and some of your most recent roles?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I've been operating, I guess, in the UK since, well, when did I get my first job? Probably 1997, I think, or back in black and white. Anyway, it seems a long time ago. Um, and went through a number of roles in professional sport, working around rugby, soccer, and tennis. I guess people will most know me from the times of around early 2000s when I started off as the national program manager for athlete development at Sport Scotland. So I worked across a range of things, and that was really where I started to get organised into the player development things with soccer, working a lot with the SFA, and looking at their player development structures and frameworks, and also travelling with some of the national teams with regards to a sports science role there, and moving through. I went from there back down to the head of human performance with England Rugby League, and that was really a great opportunity for a forward thinking governing body to really start to think about how do you integrate all the aspects of science, conditioning, and medicine into one department. And I think that's part of a journey that's led on now, and a number of teams are coming on. So I stayed in rugby league for a few years, and then I did a period of really interesting consultancy around. Had some great stuff working with Tony Strudwick at Man United, working with Liverpool, and particularly the ladies team there, where we had 2 years of championship success in the Women's Super League, and a couple of other Premier League teams as well as some international work, and that led me to the Toronto Blue Jays in Major League Baseball, that was a really great learning experience for me. I mean, having never seen a game of baseball before I got there, that was a really nice challenge. But I spent 4 really good years there, learned a lot, and was then headhunted to go to Columbus Crew in Major League Soccer, and was there for a period of time, and now I've moved on from that role, and now I'm consulting across a range of sports at the minute, but also looking and seeing what's next.
I always like getting practitioners on that have worked in a number of different sports because I always think it's really good to get an opinion and to pull from some of the cultures of different sports as well and what we can learn from all different sports. And baseball is an interesting one, isn't it? And a couple of episodes ago, we had another guest that had been in baseball and come back out. And we were talking about some lessons. So is there anything that jumps out from you? Because obviously with rugby, with baseball, like you said, and then being involved in football as well. Was there anything that sort of jumped out or that you took into your role with Columbus that you'd potentially learnt from other sports or took from other sporting cultures?
Yeah, I mean, I think you always, I mean, every situation you're in, you learn from, right? So one of the real things that I never appreciated about baseball until I got there was the fact that baseball is always played somewhere else, in the sense that I was responsible for 9 teams,
Yeah.
spread across 3 time zones, and the wide diversity of geography in the US. So two things that I think were really important about that. One is the importance of a common language and a common means of communication through a system, so that regardless of whether I'm reading an email or in person in a meeting or looking at a report or on a Zoom, as we were using pre-COVID days back in baseball because we needed to, everyone understood what we were talking about, and everyone understood there was a common framework and a commonality of reference that we could talk to, so that regardless of whether I was talking to an athletic trainer, a physio, a strength coach, we would understand what is a hinge pattern, and what do we look like to establish whether someone has got a good hinge pattern or not, and how do we correct it, as an example. So commonality of language is one thing. I think the other thing that baseball does really, really well is utilize the power of analytics, and so the ability to get someone who's got more brains in their big toe than I've got in my entire body, and they watch the game through numbers, and that's a really, really useful skill and tool to have, because it enables us then to utilize their expertise and patterns. And I can ask, I'm always curious about things. Why is this? Why is this? What is this? They can actually use the numbers to pull things through and show it and demonstrate it, um, and do it in a lot quicker time frame than I can. But in terms of that mathematical modeling, also enables us to really say, okay, well, what if we manipulated this variable in a simulation? What impact would that have? You know, and I was able to really utilize that at Columbus, for example, to start looking at, once we'd established norms for training loads within certain drills and what each player did. We were then able to say, okay, if we put those drills into a this week's training model, what would the load be for the player? What do we anticipate them doing? So that we could start to say, okay, we predict their load to be this. Where are they going to need? Where are we going to plan to do individual top ups, etc., etc., etc. So now, look, the model doesn't always work, right? So, but you have your plan, and then no, like someone says, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. So. You know, I think what we were trying to do is to say, okay, here's the plan, here's how we would look at it, what is actually delivered, and then make the decisions live on the training field about, are we going to top this player up or not, and that sort of stuff. But that comes from having a really good uh, analyst who's able to understand both the numbers, but also work with me in terms of the context. He may not understand the physiology that underpins it or whatever, but is really good in that way. And that was something I definitely took from baseball, and something I'll definitely look to carry on forward in my roles.
That relationship there is really key, though, isn't it? Because you basically got someone that's got the context, which is yourself being involved in the sport, and then someone that's mainly looking at it from a stats point of view, but like you say, might not have too much knowledge around the context. So putting them both together and having conversations around those could obviously lead to you being able to add different aspects into the whole preparation, can't it? It's a really interesting combination.
Yeah, I think that, for me, that's the strength of any performance department, is the fact that you've got, a number of people, and they're all looking at a particular problem through their own lens, right? Their own experiences, their own background, their own. And where you get the real magic occurring in the performance department is when you get that commonality of discussion where everyone's sat down, the player is at the center of this as a process, and everyone is looking at it from their perspective, and everyone's voice is equal. And you're really able to say, okay, no, I can understand why you're saying that. So you're seeing a weakness. I need to be able to correct that weakness. So, like, for example, if the physio says a player is weak here, then we can utilize the sports scientist to say, okay, well, how weak is he? For example, using a groin squeeze or whatever, one of the range of diagnostic tests we've got. The strength coach is able to say, okay, well, what do I need to do? What are the limitations around it so I can take that number from here to there? And my role as the performance director in that discussion is to literally synthesize and make sure there's one plan that addresses and identifies the weakness and moves it through. So having all those different perspectives coming together, not everyone needs us. In fact, if everyone's got the same knowledge, background, experiences, it becomes a pretty dull discussion, right?
Yeah.
So having that trust and the ability to pull that through, I think is really. I mean, that's where the magic happens. That's the fun bit.
Yeah, it's that team dynamic, isn't it? And the culture that we've got at whatever club it is, and being able to have those open and honest sometimes conversations, isn't it? And sometimes disagreements as well, but having that environment that we can have it in.
Yeah, no, I think. I mean, no one welcomes conflict, right? But at some point, it's healthy if the fact that you've got the relationship and everyone understands. Look, our job is to really. I mean, two things. One, we've got to enhance the product on the field, right? That's first and foremost the fundamentally important thing.
Yeah.
If we're not delivering better, fitter, stronger, more robust, more mentally tough, better prepared players for the coach, then we're not doing our job. And in doing that, we've got a responsibility to push boundaries, right? So you don't push boundaries and do new things by doing what you've always done. So you've always got to be looking to challenge and think and, learn from what worked really well. Let's do more of it and build on it. What didn't work so well, and don't do it again. And and then move that through. So I think that you're not going to get that kind of environment if people are existing in fear.
Yeah.
You know, so what I really want to say to staff is, when they work with me, is like, guys, I trust you, right? I trust you to do your job. Let's have a good discussion about it. Let's have the rationale and underpinning it. Let's decide on the action plan. And once we decide on the action plan, I'm accountable.
Yeah.
You know, so
Mm.
I think that environment for me is a healthy one where everyone's opinion is respected, that we learn from each other, and that we collaborate in and around that. And like, sure, if there's going to be some conflicts and some discussion about it, great. You know,
Yeah.
but at least everyone's the reason there's conflict there is because we've all got trust and support for each other, and the conflict is around the intellectual ideas or how we achieve an aim, and that's great.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's top. Now we're going to have a discussion around training for critical moments in a game, because we've spoke a lot on this podcast. I know other podcasts have spoke a lot about speed training, developing speed, developing acceleration. But I think this is really important because, like anyone who's watched football or been involved in football, we know that those critical moments are the ones that can define wins or losses or what happens in the season. So let's start broad, mate. Let's start first the sort of approach for training for those critical moments, and then we'll get into a little bit more detail on the sort of processes.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think for me, the first and foremost is if you're going to structure any training, it's about you got to have that understanding of what it is the coach is trying to achieve on the field, right? So what is the style of play that is going to define this team? And that's literally what you're preparing players for.
Yeah.
So that having that understanding, I think, is critical. And a few years ago, you saw it at Liverpool with the team. They were, their philosophy was every time we got the ball and moving forward, can we get five players moving around the ball,
Yeah.
right? Now that's gonna create a different physiological demand than someone who's got a different style of play, right?
Mm.
So at Columbus, for example, the key thing was about transition. So the coach wanted to play, is a high press game. So rob players a space. So there's got to be some intensity there. But can we turn attack into defense and defense into attack in under 6 seconds? Right? That was the key to the style of play. So that means that there's going to be certain positions within that are going to have, and typically your wingers and your fullbacks, for example, they're going to be doing a lot of high intensity running and a lot of sprinting. So we need to make sure that we're preparing the players for that, because if not, the style of play isn't going to happen.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. I think it's really important to start at that point, isn't it? Because sometimes we'll see ways of working and methodologies and try and put it into whatever our program is where it doesn't really fit. And I think you're right. Like, we need to determine what it is we're trying to hit. And like you said, the style of play, but then also the players that are involved, the formations and things like that, because we talk about like wide players. How many wide players have we got? What sort of player are they? There's a lot of factors, isn't there, that go into it that we need to determine from the start.
Yeah, no, you're right, and I think that's where sometimes it's about being key about understanding what we look at through our performance metrics as well. So there was you could look at the stats and say players run 11, 12 kilometers in a game, whatever they do in MLS, and therefore we need to train players to run 11 or 12 kilometers.
Yeah.
And if you focused in on that, then you'd probably lead yourself down the wrong training path, if that makes sense. We need players to be able to get there through repeat high intensity metrics. So when I looked at training sessions, total distance, for example, it's a measure of time on feet and it's a measure of fatigue, right? But that's all it is. It wasn't something I really paid a lot of attention to, particularly as at Columbus, for example, we had a number of training fields, and I know most of the Premier League teams like this as well. You have a number of training fields, and the players they do a drill on field one and walk to field two to do a different. That's volume that's going to be
Yeah.
measured that doesn't contribute, right? So, we would have for each training day, we would identify what is the key metric that's going to determine our physiological contribution to this session. And so if it's an extensive session, we might look at high speed running. If it's an intensive session, we're going to look at high metabolic load, for example, as targets. And if we follow things in that way, then we can actually begin to understand what is the objective we're trying to achieve, and then we can tailor the methods accordingly.
Yeah, yeah. And with that, because obviously we're talking real about context now, aren't we, in terms of what those volumes look like? And one thing I was going to ask is around like isolated speed work and sort of contextual speed work and how you've incorporated that into training, because obviously we know that in a lot of small sided games there'll be a lot of high speed work, but can we talk around the sort of structure on how you sort of whether you did use isolated work, how that was embedded into the program, and then along with the contextual work?
Yeah, sure. I think that a lot of it comes down to training at the individual. So you got a team training session, but you really want to focus down what's the individual needs of the player, right? So if you look at those opportunities for speed training, generally a warm up is a good time to reinforce mechanics,
Yeah,
um, but you never actually get the exertions that you might want to get from. You might finish off with a couple at the end, but that's largely it. So I think we would look at it in terms of if you've got small sided games, what you're going to see a lot of is accelerations, decelerations, and direction changes. But you're never going to see someone expressing into high speed running or the maximum velocity stuff, or very rarely. You don't get much of it at all. So where are the opportunities within the week that we expect that to occur? And this is where you sit down with the coach and say, look, on the periodization model for most teams is fairly fixed, right? You know what you're going to do, game day -1, game day -2, etc. So within those sessions, you can roughly plan. Okay, this is the day we're going to get high accelerations, decelerations. This is the session we're going to get top end speed and maximum velocity running. And what you begin to do is to say, well, what are the individual zones that I really need players to start to hit, right? Because for each player, one of the things I've always done is built I don't know what you call it, a functional risk profile or whatever. It's like basically what keeps this player on the field and keeps him playing well, right? So you understand what does a good extensive session look like in a player, and a player, when this player has an optimum game, what does he typically do in the extensive session? What does he typically do in the intensive session? What does he typically do in game day -1? And you can, so therefore you set in those zones, and that's one part of that performance plan for the player. So we would look at it and say, okay, on this day there's this drill, we expect the players to hit this, right? And you would construct the drill to do it, and that's where you'd speak to the coach about, look, can we adapt this drill to increase the space available, or etc. So we try and get it. One of the things I would always try and do is incorporate as much of the mechanical loading or the fitness work within the soccer stuff. I think that's important,
yeah,
because separating it out, the players don't really like that. It's more time. It's more. But then what we did do at the end of it was individual work, and it's then saying to the coach, okay, for example, we had one centre forward who never achieved a sprint in training. No matter what sort of work was done, the way he trained didn't bring about those sprints, but he also had a history of hamstring strains and groin strains that we knew from previous clubs.
yeah,
So now there's a pretty typical pattern, right? And I've seen it before in other teams where you've got people who they don't achieve the sprints in training, they're required to do them in a game, and suddenly they're injured, right? No surprise there. So how do we get ahead of that in this particular player? Well, one is we tailor his off-field work, his gym program, and his preparation work around protecting the hip and groin region, right? So there's a focus on additional hamstring work and groin work. But secondly, what you do is say to that player, this is if you're not going to hit this in training, on with this guy I've got in mind was always game day -2. All right, we're going to take you afterwards, and we're going to do the isolated sprint work.
yeah,
And if I could do that in a drill where I could speak to the coach and say, have you got someone who's going to work on, I don't know, crossing and finishing? Can he put the ball in front of him and we'll make the guy sprint onto it and finish? Great. If not, I'm just going to sprint the guy.
yeah.
Either way, we're going to do something contextual. A real classic example, and I've seen this in when I was doing my consulting with some of the clubs as well, is they say centre backs, right? we're seeing injuries in centre backs and they're occurring in games. Why is that? And it's typically, again, it's that the acceleration and sprint work. When you look at the drills they do in training, they might not move more than 5-6 meters laterally, and they're not getting that sort of sprint movement in. So then it's a case of speaking to the assistant coaches, and we did this, at Columbus a lot, where can you identify drills where you get the centre backs from that transition period? The ball's cleared, the centre backs have got to get out. Can we just turn the get out bit? Can we just turn that into a sprint? Right. So therefore, they get the sprint distance, and then the discussion is, okay, how far and how many? So we're working with the coaches to try and set those parameters, and it's done within those drills.
It pleases everyone, that, doesn't it? Because the coach gets their bit, the player gets obviously to play. That's what they're there for, and then you can control obviously what you're trying to take out of that session, doesn't it? But I know you've touched on it there, but can you just go into that, the importance, because we spoke about like putting it into sort of game scenarios and having a response to like external stimuli. So whether it's like opposition, whether it's the ball moving, whether it's a teammate, how would you incorporate that? And what's the importance behind doing that crosses over onto game day?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's really insightful because there's nothing that mimics the chaotic nature of the game like the chaotic nature of the game.
Yeah,
that makes sense. So the key players create time and they create space, right? That's why it always looks so easy, because everything seems to slow down. Key players make the game slow down, even though it's going at 100 miles an hour, right? And they do that because they're solving the problems that the game is imposing on them. Soccer's a game of time and space. If you can control those two things, then you're going to do well as a player. So we can do all of the, insert mechanics drills that we want to do, right? And they're important. Right. The reason they're important is not just because players are going. This is one thing that does drive me nuts, is when I see players just doing drills for the sake of doing drills.
Yeah.
Right. The reason we do those mechanics drills is so that one, in a warm up, we activate, right. But two, those drills are about reinforcing joint position, and joint position determines muscle function. So it's not a case of doing the drills; it's a case of doing the drills well, so that we educate and train the muscles to work in the way they should work. That's the purpose of those. But it's not gonna help with the player using that on the field. It's a tool, right? And then we take that into let's call it speed expression, right? And speed expression is where you're actually doing the sprint drills and high speed running, and the purpose of that is to develop the neuromuscular qualities within the player so that they're robust enough and physically capable enough to be able to exert the speed when they need to exert the speed, right? Because if you look at most movement in soccer, it's a case of accelerate, decelerate, change direction, re-accelerate. But when you re-accelerate, you're going to go in a straight line because it's the shortest distance between 2 points. Yeah. So you need the mechanics, you need the expression, but then you've got to put it in the game context. That's when the reactions come in, the decisions come in, everything comes into that. So I would always look at having those three components working together, if that makes sense. So if a player needs more, if he needs more of the high speed running or the mechanics, then we can put that in the individual work on, but the only place you're going to get good decision making is in the context of reacting to other players. So one of the things I actually, we did with a couple of the guys there who needed to do that was actually let's work on your mechanics and build it up, and then let's work on what sort of things you should be reacting to, but then we need to put that into the context of the game, because what I can do with you, one-on-one in a context of thing is going to be very different to what we're going to achieve in a small sided and group game. But at least we're trying to give them the tools about these are the things you should be thinking about.
So is it fair to say with that, if we take those three and put it into a bit of like I don't know what you call it, where you spend your time or your energy, you could just tweak the amount that you spend on each one per player, because
Yeah.
depending on what they need. So if they need a little bit more in terms of the contextual work, you can sort of turn that up a little bit, turn one of the others down, and then vice versa along the way.
Yeah, no, I think so. It comes back to that, like, we have you go back to that profile I talked about earlier on. What's gonna keep this player playing and performing, and what's gonna make them better, right? So one of the things I think that we often forget, and I have to remind myself all the time, is we're in player development. So whether you're working in an academy system or whether you're working with the top players at an international level, you're trying to make those players better. Now, your window of adaptation is going to be different, right, depending on your context, but you're always trying to get better every day. Um, and so, in mapping that player profile out, it's about what is going to make this player more effective in the position that they have. And
Yeah.
so it's exactly right. It's like, do I need to emphasize their mechanics? Do I need to emphasize their expression, and also understand why? So the centre forward we were talking about earlier on, he needed the expression because it was protective against injury for him, as well as being effective in his position. You know, so for me, it's always been about, in any team sport context, you've got the team schedule and you've got the team training session, but the physical components within that are individualized.
Yeah, yeah. That's vital, isn't it? I think a lot of people relate to that players training differently to how they play, to put it politely, because we all know players that have been in that same boat, and I just think it's really interesting the sort of approach you take with them, not necessarily trying to get more out of the training because they might not change the way they train, but then identifying some of the factors that, if you do train like this and you only hit those markers, these are the things we need to put in place to hopefully reduce that risk of injury and anything that's going to come up throughout a season.
Yeah, I think so. And like, context is key. If you looked at, I had a number of discussions this with front office staff and other people around things, is that you the physical data that we see in a game never determines whether we play well or not, right? Um, the fact that we ran more in a game or we ran more, it doesn't tell us anything.
Yeah,
In fact, some of the most effective players, I can think about from last season, they seem to have the physical stats were not that, they certainly weren't the highest in, and they didn't run the most, they didn't sprint the most, but they did their job better than anybody, you know. Um, and it's one of those misnomers where you come back and say, oh, we performed really well, and actually you didn't. And sometimes when you lose, you actually get the highest sprint speeds because you're spending all your time chasing the ball.
yeah, yeah.
So I think trying to look at the physical variables in isolation of the context of the game, I think you almost set yourself up for failure.
Yeah, I think I'm right in saying a few seasons ago they took the distance covered by Barcelona when they were winning Champions Leagues and leagues and all the rest of it, and it was quite relatively low. But it's because they weren't doing the chasing, like you say. They had the ball and they were in control. So it's context, isn't it? It's so important.
Yeah, I think so. And it's also, for me, it's the importance of having, being in and around the training so that you can observe that, and so you can look at the data, but you've also got the coach's eye as well, and you can see how are the two marrying up together and working together. And that was why it was really useful for me. Again, go back to the example we talked about earlier on with having the analyst on the side who's monitoring the GPS things live. Is, we can start to say, okay, if the drill does this, and this guy's got a mathematical genius, he can start to say, well, okay, the drill is probably going to do this. It's going to be this many meters per minute. The player's probably end up with this. He's good.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah,
Um, so, and that enables you to have some interaction with the coach live. Because the coach would quite often wander up and say, Clive, how are we looking? And it's like, no, we're good. Or he's like, can I let this run a couple more minutes? Or that sort of thing. And those discussions and that live interaction are really useful.
Just to play devil's advocate on that a little bit, to relate it to coaches that might not have the privilege of having that guy on the side that's able to feed back that live information. I think you just answered the question there, by the way, but by getting the coach over. But what would your advice be to a practitioner possibly working at a club in that situation on putting out those drills and trying to keep them as effective as possible.
I mean, yeah. Look, if you haven't got the data live and available to you, then the key thing is you've got to use your coach's eye and look at it against the plan, right? You've got to know your plan. So you've got to go in knowing how long do I expect this session to, expect this drill to go on for, in terms of the relative work to rest ratios, the duration, etc. And you've also got to have your coach's eye.
Yeah.
You can't. The data is never going to be a substitute. The data enhances your trade craft as a coach, right? But it's not a replacement for it. So you always have to work with both in conjunction. And look, even when you got it going live and you got all the information available to you, you still have that scenario where the coach is like, I might be looking and going, we're getting close to the limit here, and he's like, Clive, I don't give a shit. We're gonna keep doing this drill because,
Yeah.
but because I've got the plan and because I know what's coming next. Okay, well, if we're gonna red line here, we need to back off there.
Yeah.
And those kind of things. So that you're able to make those decisions because so the more information you have available to you, the better your decisions become because they're more informed, right? But ultimately, it's still the human being making the decision. So I would say if you're in that situation and you're working with the coach and you know the plan, you got your coach's eye, you can see if players are getting tired, or you can see if they're, if the intensity is staying there, and they're great.
Yeah, it's that effectiveness of the drill, isn't it? Because I think we've all done drills before. When you see it get to that point and you see it turn, you're like, yeah, we're not quite getting what we wanted out of this now. And that's the time, isn't it, to potentially step in or change something.
Yeah, and I think there's, I remember go back to my really early days working in rugby, for example, and one of the things the coaches used to do was to do line out throws, and they would practice line out throws and practice line out throws and practice line out throws and practice line out throws, and you could see the quality the quality of the session would increase, and then it would start to do that, and then after a while, and the players are getting tired of lifting, and the guys are getting tired of throwing in, and the coach is going, nope, you didn't get it, do it again. I'm talking to him and saying, look, in a game you might get 10 of these, right? And if you don't get each one right, we're not going to do well. Why don't you just do 10 of them?
Yeah.
It forces the guys to really do things, and I understand when you're learning moves or learning this, you repeat it. But I put it in a soccer context. I've seen training sessions where, you're looking at the coaches, right? First one to score 2 goals. If an A team is doing an attack against the defence and the B team is doing an attack against the defence, first one to score 2 goals wins, or the next 2 goals. And it goes on, and no one's scoring, and no one's scoring, and no one's scoring. And the coach is going, we're going to keep going until someone scores. And you can just see the players like, oh my God, don't make a mistake.
Yeah.
Pressure ramps up, but as the pressure ramps up, the level of intensity just drops off. And the drill has suddenly got a completely different objective to it.
That's what you got to question, isn't it? Is it keeping that same objective?
Yeah. And I remember one discussion with the coach around it where we had a player who was, he kept a drill going and going and going and going and going and going and going because it wasn't, the ball wasn't going in. And then afterwards, I took one of the players to do his planned sprint stuff. And the coach was like, well, why are you doing that? I've just gone way over volume. I've gone way over volume, And I said, because you've gone over volume, but we haven't done any more high-speed running. We haven't done any more sprint stuff, right? The drill was literally just volume. So what that guy really needs, he hasn't got.
Yeah.
So sure, we didn't do the same number of sprints because he'd done more volume, but he still had to get a certain number of sprints in to achieve that plan. So you never want to say, no, I've planned this, therefore that's exactly what I got to deliver. You've got to always be flexible and adjust on the fly. But if that guy didn't get those sprints in on game day -2, we know from his history he's in danger moving forward. So that's kind of how we applied that.
No, that's a really nice example to sum it up, I think, as well, and how it practically works. The final thing I was going to ask about the sort of contextual stuff, Clive, is on your experience and opinion as well, is when you put in a drill in place and you're trying to make it specific for the player. So say you're using a centre forward who's possibly receiving crosses from a wide man. how important do you think it is to use the exact players? So to take like that, the wide player that they are going to be interacting with, or whether they've got a centre midfielder playing the ball into them. Do you think there's any importance in that? Or do you think it's more a case of just reacting to things like the player and the ball and some of the other external stimuli?
That's a really good question. I think it's probably important to have a mixture of both. In all honesty, you want guys that are going to play together to get used to what they do, right? So you know people's tendencies, you know their cues, you know what to look for. You know where they're liable to place the ball, or and you know if a guy wants a ball played into his feet, played into his head, played in front of him, right? You know that. So I guess as often as possible, the key thing is that, look, if we're doing our job in a perfect world, then every day it's going to be the player that the coach wants to put in,
Yeah.
right? Um, and for example, Columbus, I'd say we had a really good injury record. In pre-season, for example, we had 96% player availability, right? So we had two players lost 2 days due to soft tissue injury. But we trained every day for 6 weeks. We played 5 games. We had that amount of player availability, but we still had to change players.
Mm,
You know,
yeah.
so you're never going to get that 100%. So I think it's important to rotate players within those roles, because that's what's going to happen during the course of a season. You can't, no one can avoid injuries. Don't care how good you are. And also, some of these drills, like we talked about, they're going to be in isolation, right? So if you had players who weren't going to play in a game, under conditioning is a bigger problem, or as big a problem as over conditioning, right? So if you have players who aren't going to play in a game and aren't playing regularly, they need to get that high metabolic load work. You might typically do a conditioning circuit after a game, but for me, a conditioning circuit is going to be about a centre back doing a number of back pedals or side sprints or whatever to receive the ball, to play it back to someone who's going to play it wide to sprint down the wing, to cross the ball into a centre forward who's going to sprint in and then come back and receive a ball and then sprint in again. So that's how a circuit's going to be. You're not going to get the starting players to be doing that at the end of a session. There might be a coach filling in, or there might be a. So the answer is, I think, is both. Is they've got to be able to react to different players, but they also want the familiarity of the players in and around them.
Brill. And then I know we've touched on this again quite a bit, but we're going to talk about speed training even as a protective component against injury. And I'm sure many people listening to the podcast will be like, well, yeah, that's what I use speed work for. That's part of my speed training philosophy. But what's your sort of approach with that? I know we've touched on it and you give some really good examples on it, but is there anything else that you sort of think about that we need to discuss?
No, for me, there were some really good discussions of this in and around the COVID time, for example, when you're in lockdown and isolation, and talking to other colleagues in other clubs. Some of them were saying, look, we're using this time to get a really high chronic load, right? So they were prescribing players a lot of long distance runs, or a lot of et cetera, et cetera. And I understand that, because it's easy to prescribe, and you don't normally get that chance to do that. My issue with it was twofold, threefold actually. One is, how conditioned are the players to get in that high chronic load?
Yeah.
Because they're not used to it. Two is the fact that we're not getting the same medical treatment, daily care of the players, because that's just not available to them. So what's the effect of that load? And thirdly, how does it prepare them for the game? Right? Now, at that time, the players also weren't getting the 2 to 3 weight training sessions a week that they would normally get either. So they're not getting any. So we were doing the best we could with the equipment available to us at players' houses, etc., and getting stuff, but they weren't getting that same neuromuscular stimulus and stress. So my approach was, can we use that time? And bearing in mind, players were already conditioned because they'd done pre-season and we started the league.
Yeah. Yeah.
Could we use that time to do repeat high intensity work with direction change, with acceleration, deceleration, with And that for me achieved two things. One, it gave them the conditioning base they needed, but two, it was more closely associated with the demand of the game, so that when we came back into the training process, the players would be better prepared for it. And speed for me is there's two ways to really stimulate fast twitch fibers, right? One is a high load, and the other is a high velocity.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a way of actually getting into those motor units and really challenging them and focusing them, so that we were both preparing the players to perform, but also it helped to be preventative against injury as much as we could. Right, going back into again post-COVID scenario, you've got fixture congestion like no one's seen before. You've got players unprepared physically because you haven't had the volume of pre-season that you would normally have. So injuries are going to occur. We expect to see more hamstring injuries. We expect to see more ankle injuries, etc.
Yeah, definitely. It's a mad time. We spoke about it a lot on this podcast, and there's many different opinions out there, but it's really hard, isn't it? It's really tough to sort of look ahead and be prepared for. Well, we don't know what we're preparing for half the time as well, don't we? That's part of the issue too. Awesome, that Clive. Well, let's move it on, because we're also going to just ask about the importance of making time for speed work as well. And I think this will probably ring true with a lot of practitioners listening, possibly people that are working with limited time in academies in the UK, or whatever the role it is. So have you got any advice to those guys on creating time to make sure that they get in their speed work?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it comes down to the priority that you give it, right? And one of the things I learned earlier on, and probably through making mistakes, is the fact that if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So
Yeah.
you've got to decide what your priorities are, and you've got to proportion your time accordingly. So we talk all the time about periodization, and planning is about what are you going to emphasize at a particular time, and then making sure that you've got the prerequisites in place to achieve that. So if you want to emphasize speed, make sure you've got players who are conditioned powerfully to do that. So for me, it's about really trying to understand at a certain point in time, what is it you're trying to emphasize, and then apportion your time accordingly to that. So there's always opportunity. Every warm up is a learning opportunity for the players, and a great chance for us as coaches to really reinforce the mechanics and the neural preparation stuff. Right? If we're doing that, then we don't necessarily need to set aside additional time for that, unless there's a player that doesn't get it.
Yeah.
Right? In which case, let's make time for that player to do that. And so at the end of most training sessions, and not every training session, because there's but players, there may be one or two sessions a week where players get opportunities for individual work. Right? So and that's the discussion then with the coaches. Okay, do you need this guy to work on something particular, or can I take him for this, and here's why I want to do it? And it doesn't take many repetitions to really be able to emphasize those things. You're not talking about another half an hour on top of a training session. It's like, I've got this block. How can I put it in? Now, with regards to that, if you're then talking about maximum velocity work, you've got to understand that how can I put this? You're not going to get maximum velocity at the end of a training session where players fatigued.
Yeah.
That's why I emphasized it on game day -2, for example, is because those sessions tended to be shorter, but we could recover the players significantly. The sprint work doesn't take a long time to recover from if you do it with the right intensity and the right volume. So one of the things that's always interested me with the GPS statistics, for example, on using sprint work, if a player typically, a player will register a sprint if they go at 70% above 70% of max, right? So the average speed at Columbus, for example, is 9.2 meters a second as a max velocity, right? That was recorded in a linear test. So if a player goes above 70% of that it got recorded as a sprint. Well, for me, that's not a maximum sprint, 70%, right?
Yeah.
So that's where you've got the numbers, but you've got to use the coach's eye as well and really say, have I given the time for this player to be really doing the expression that he needs to do? And so I would work a lot with the individual players and say, look, we need you to work on this. Here's when we're going to do it, and set time aside. And sometimes that means giving up other things. So, for example, does the player need to go in the weight room, or can I use that weight room time to go and do additional speed work? There's your compromise, because you want to understand what is it that's going to make this player a better player.
Yeah. That's
You
the
know?
key question, isn't it? That's what it keeps going back to. Yeah, that's the key question, definitely.
Well, I mean, I think for me, that's one of the things that sports, sports scientists or strength and conditioning staff have been we've been bad at as an industry for a number of years, is not evidencing how we make players better, right? So if you want to go back to talking about how we understand the key transitions in a game, so one of the discussions I had with our front office when I came in was not that we would use things like mass tests or mass runs to demonstrate improvements in fitness over a preseason, but that I would demonstrate the impact on critical factors in the game. So, for example, what we did do, and again, value of an analyst here, we took at the end of preseason, we looked at all the sprints from the previous year that the players did in games, and then we took the last 3 preseason games and said, what are the sprints the players are doing? And how does it compare? And what we were finding was that in 60 minutes of a preseason game this year, they were doing more than 1 standard deviation than they were doing in 90 minutes last year. Right? Ergo, they're doing a lot more sprints and they're more capable of it than they were doing the previous year. That tells me, and it tells the coach, far more about the work we're doing than, we got an improvement of 100 meters in a mass run.
Yeah.
For example, right? So it's being able to put things into that context and demonstrating impact of the work we do, rather than saying, he ran further, or he squatted more, or whatever.
Yeah, brilliant. Some top information in there, mate. That was absolutely brilliant. Clive, we'll move it on because I'm wary of time. I know you've got one hell of a journey to tackle shortly, but we'll move it on to some quick fire questions just to wrap up. To start with, who are some of the biggest influences on your career so far?
Oof, there are I mean, far too many. Like I always believe that you're a learner, right? So you always look at stuff. If I had to name 3, right? Let's say 3. One, probably Professor Mike Stone, who really, I mean, for the last, I don't know, 50 years has been publishing the strength and conditioning stuff that has made a lot of us think about planning and periodization and those sort of stuff. Lawrence Seagrave has been a massive influence for me in terms of understanding speed and movement and how I can apply the principles to the work that I do. And I think the other one that deserves a massive mention is Tony Strudwick at Man United, who, I mean, Tony demonstrated at United in a successful club the real value of sports performance, sports science, and integrated working and moving that through. And with what he achieved at United at the time, he was there, I think is phenomenal and a learning thing for us all. And he's someone I look to and rely on a lot. We still talk a lot.
Brilliant. And the next one, what would you say your best strength is as a practitioner, or biggest strength as a practitioner?
I'll leave it to other people to say. Look, the key thing for me is that I want to learn and I'm curious, right? So I think that hunger and that desire to always get better and never want to rest and relax on what I think I might know, right? There's always going to be someone who's going to be smarter than me and better than me. So what is it I can take from those people? So I think that curiosity and that desire to get better is probably my biggest strength.
And then next one, what is there any sort of standout CPD you've done recently?
Recently is an interesting concept.
We can stretch it. We can stretch it.
Yeah. Look, one of the things I've always valued is the ability to either go in and see someone else working and see what they do, or have someone come into our environment and give us feedback, right?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, so I think they're the most valuable. Spending time with quality practitioners and seeing what they do, and having the ability to unpick and talk through that is massively valuable. So obviously, during lockdown isolation, that sort of stuff hasn't happened,
Yeah.
right? Um, so recent is an interesting context. But for example, a couple of years ago, I was lucky. I spent some time with Des Ryan at Arsenal. That was great, talking to his staff, bouncing ideas off each other, looking at, in your environment, what do you do? How does that apply to my environment? How might I adapt this? Why did you do that? I think that was really valuable and a great learning experience from working with a really good team. Um, the other one I think that stands out, the U.S. Olympic Center in 2019 did an invited symposium where they brought in 100 professionals, and the idea of that, it was full on. We were like 8 in the morning till 8 at night. Um, but it wasn't just the usual keynote presentations, and there was some, and I mean, I was lucky enough to do one. But the idea of the keynote presentations is we broke them up. You presented for a bit, then you set some discussion topics, and people were
Mhm.
put in tables to discuss the topics that you had and share ideas. Then the presentation continued, then there was another discussion and another topic. So it wasn't just your typical information send. It was all about what are you hearing from what the information that's being sent. You discuss it with five people who've all got a different lens than you've got and a different experience. So what are they taking from it? Learn from it, make some notes, and then move on. So it was 3 days of that sort of really focused, interactive discussion thing, and that for me was phenomenal because there was no time to just sit and relax because
Yeah.
someone was always going to ask you what you thought about what had just been said, you know, and that I think was really interesting.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think there's massive value in that, isn't there? Having those discussions, like you say, going back to the sort of last question about visiting people and getting people's point of view, but then also conferences or seminars that are run like that are so powerful, aren't they? Because you take so much more away from it.
I think so. I mean, the one thing I've always learned is that there's going to be people with better ideas than mine out there, you know. So you want to be able to access those, interpret them, and sure, just because they do it doesn't mean to say that you're going to be able to.
Yeah, definitely,
But like,
definitely.
what can I learn from it?
Yeah, 100%. And then final ones, Clive, just the same question, but for firstly a coach and then a player. What do you think one of the most important traits a coach should have?
Uh, you, People have to trust you, right? Um, without trust and without being able to build relationships, there's you're not going to succeed as a
Yeah,
coach. So um, trust is about competence and character. So you gotta know your stuff and be credible at knowing your stuff, but you've also got to put it across in a way that the players want to buy into it and want to believe into it, and know that you've got their best interests at heart. And like when in moving on from Columbus, one of the things that mattered most to me was the players who contacted me and said, you know, thank you so much for taking care of me, and that those sorts of things are important. That's what's really going to help you move forward is that relationships.
and then just to refer that to the players. So thinking about some of those players that you've had the fair to say the greatest impact with, what do you think are some traits that sort of stand out from those players?
I think I mean, work ethic
Yeah,
is one, but also I think players who do better. They're the players who take responsibility for their own program, and they don't just blindly do what the coach tells them to do. You know, I love players asking me why, and that actually helps the building the buy into that process, right? I want you to do this because why? Because, and
yeah,
I so one of the key things that that I borrowed from someone or stole from someone. I can't even remember who it was now, but they said you should always be able to answer if someone asks you about your program. You should always be able to answer the why 5 times,
yeah,
right? Why do you do this? Because of that. Yeah, but why? Well, because of this. Why? Right? And if you can answer the why 5 times, then you actually understand it fully, comprehensively, and but also players should be able to ask that because they want to understand the why. If they understand the why and they understand it's to their best interests, then they'll do it. And I think those players who are willing to engage in that discussion, and not in an objectionable way, but they're curious, they want to take responsibility for their own body and their own program.
Yeah.
You know, they're the players I want to engage with most, and I think they're the players that are going to get the best out of any performance specialist.
Top class. Brilliant. Clive, just finally, if people want to follow your work or potentially reach out, is there anywhere that you direct them?
No, I mean, I use. I'm not a massively in-depth user of social media and that sort of stuff, but you can find me on Twitter. I think it's Clive Sport S&C, but I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook. And again, depending on the nature of what the material is, I'll use any of those platforms differently. But my email is humanperformancecb@gmail.com. So if people want to reach out, I will do my best to answer any questions or inquiries that come in.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time, mate. Really appreciate you coming on. I know it's a busy time and you, like I said, you got a big drive ahead, so all the best with that. But yeah, thank you very much for coming on and giving up your time.
No, that's really enjoyable. Thanks so much, Ben. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Clive.
Bye bye.